There are several different versions of the Thema Mundi. They all have one feature in common, which is the crab is rising in all of these different instances of the Thema Mundi. The most common version, the one that we'll be spending the most time on at the moment, has 15 portions of the crab rising, and each of the planets at 15 portions of their domiciles in the solar hemisphere. So we have Selene at 15 portions of the crab, which is also the rising portion. We have Helios at 15 portions of the lion, Hermes at 15 portions of the Virgin, Aphrodite at 15 portions of the balance, Ares at 15 portions of the scorpion, Zeus at 15 portions of the archer, and Kronos at 15 portions of the goat-horned one. There is another version of this that is evidently of Persian origin that has each of the planets in its exaltation portion. And there is also a somewhat strange version that is found at the end of Paul that has the planets largely in the same positions as the normal version of the Thema Mundi, with 3 exceptions. It has Helios in the 19th portion of the ram instead of the 15th portion of the lion, and it also has Hermes in the 7th portion of the Virgin, and Aphrodite at the 3rd portion of the balance. These 3 exceptions are interesting on their own account. I will be saying a few words about the different value of the placement of Hermes and Aphrodite. It will be of some significance in my interpretation of the domiciles of the planets. One of the first and obvious things that we can notice about this chart is that each of the planets, being at 15 portions, if we use the normal chart, is in fact in its own individual degree, in its own monomoiria, which one might expect for a hypothetical chart which is intended to be also a kind of ideal chart. The second thing, which is also perfectly obvious, is the planets have their domiciles at increasing distances from the domicile of Helios in a very regular manner. So we have the order Helios, Hermes, Aphrodite, Ares, Zeus, and Kronos. This is one of the planetary orders that I mentioned earlier, what we might call the Platonic order of the planets. What I did call the Platonic order of the planets earlier. But can we say anything more exact about why the planets would have these places as their domiciles, other than the fact that they seem to have the increasing distances from Helios, at least according to the Platonic scheme? If we look at Hermes in the Virgin, the image most proximate to the lion in the solar hemisphere, and if we invoke this alternative value that we find in Paul that has Hermes at the 7th portion of the Virgin rather than the 15th, we notice immediately something interesting, which is that Hermes is about 22 portions distant from the position of Helios, which was, even if it's not perfectly astronomically accurate, the recognized value of the maximum elongation of Hermes from Helios. In other words, Hermes is at its station. It's placed at the position of its station. Similarly, when we look at the alternative value for Aphrodite, its placement at the third portion of the balance, we see that Aphrodite is placed 47 or 48 portions from Helios, which was the accepted value for the maximum elongation of Aphrodite from Helios. In other words, Aphrodite is also at its station point in this alternative version of Paul. What does this tell us? It tells us that the planets are put in their domiciles in such a way as to correspond at least roughly to their stations. And of course, the station is the place where a planet comes to its rest. And of course, a domicile is a place where one takes his or her rest. If we look at Zeus and its elongation from Helios, we find that it is exactly 120 portions, which is the ideal value for a station for all the planets that are capable of reaching that elongation from Helios. So it is appropriate that Zeus would have its domicile in the Archer. Now, if we look at Ares, which has its domicile 90 portions from Helios, we find what is an apparent exception. However, if you remember, when I was discussing the assignment of planets to the two sects, one of the rationales that was given for the assignment of Ares to the nocturnal sect is that it makes more figures relative to Helios than the other planets because of this strange anomalous figure that Ares makes when it is 90 portions from Helios, where it is slowing down and stays very, very slow prior to its station for as long as 6 months. It can remain 6 months in the same image before it actually comes to a station. Now, somehow this seems to me quite appropriate for Ares. If you ask yourself, what is the most impatient or restless of the planets, the planet that doesn't really want to slow down, come to a rest, it would certainly be Ares. So I do not find this position of Ares inconsistent with the notion that planets have their domiciles when they are taking their rest or preparing to take their rest or something of that kind. Kronos would also seem to be an apparent exception. However, Kronos is actually retrograding when it gets to its domicile, as if it has been more than eager to take its rest, which of course is consistent with the fact that Kronos is understood to be an especially sluggish planet. So I believe that there is something deeper here in the assignment of planets to domiciles than simply an increasing planetary order in the distance of the different planets from Helios. We also see something that, again, is perfectly obvious in the Thema Mundi, that the natural benefic planets, Aphrodite and Zeus, are in the most harmonious configurations with the domicile of Helios. Aphrodite is in a hexagonal relationship with the domicile of Helios, and Zeus is in a trigonal relationship. This would also be motivation from the later phrase that Aphrodite is the lesser benefic and Zeus is the greater benefic, because the hexagonal relationship, although harmonious, is understood to be less benefic than the trigonal relationship. This leaves us with Hermes, which is in aversion to Helios. Its image is unconnected to the image occupied by Helios. Ares, whose image is tetragonal to the image occupied by Helios, and Kronos, whose image is in aversion to the image occupied by Helios. The tetragon is, of course, a disharmonious relationship, and it would be perfectly in accord to have Ares in that position. Aversions in general mean that there is a lack of connection between a planet occupying an unconnected image and another planet occupying the image that it is unconnected to. And it seems quite appropriate under those circumstances that we would have the two natural malefics in these poor placements relative to the image occupied by Helios, and Hermes in this proximity to Helios. These matters are all quite obvious and have been pointed out by other people as well once people began to actually examine the Thema Mundi. Now, quite a number of years ago, I noticed something that I got extremely excited about. Namely, that the places of exaltation of the different planets, when their exaltation images are seen in the Thema Mundi, also correspond to the good places, the places conducive to business according to the scheme of Hermes. In other words, the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th, namely the fishes, the ram, and the bull, are all exaltation places. As is the crab itself, at the exaltation of Zeus, as is the goat-horned one, the exaltation of Ares, as is the balance, the exaltation of Kronos, and as is the virgin, the exaltation of Hermes. All of these images are in places connected with the rising image, the crab. And they are the good places according to the scheme set out by Hermes. Now, some of you may know that there is a lot of controversy surrounding the origin of the exaltations. And for a long time, it was thought that the exaltations derived from Babylonian sources. I find it somewhat hard to believe that the exaltations could have had such Babylonian origin and then fit into the Thema Mundi in such a consistent manner with the doctrine of good and bad places. I mentioned earlier that it also seems somewhat implausible that the exaltations could have had Babylonian origins because of the rule noticed by Porphyry that the diurnal planets have their exaltations in an image that is trigonal to one of their domiciles, whereas the nocturnal planets have their exaltations in an image that is hexagonal to one of their domiciles. In other words, we note here a consistency of three Hellenistic concepts: the placement of the exaltations, the doctrine of sect, and the doctrine of the places conducive to business, namely the good places, in the Thema Mundi. I fail to see how the exaltations could have had a Babylonian origin and still have this internal consistency. Unless, of course, the Babylonians had the doctrine of sect and also had the doctrine of the good places, and as of this day, there is no evidence that they had such. Once I had noticed this fact, that the exaltation images are in fact coincident with the good places in the Thema Mundi, I began to search for other such relationships that might serve to tie together other Hellenistic concepts all in one chart, namely the Thema Mundi, in such a manner that we could see all of these Hellenistic concepts together, take them in one glance, and show how concepts, each of which has its own rationale, when viewed from the perspective of the Thema Mundi, are also consistent with one another. The Thema Mundi, as I said, is the best evidence that Hellenistic astrology was a rational construct. And you are going to see that more and more as I continue.